The morning sky above SciFiPrime burned red with smoke and fire as Elder Counselor Vextai stood at the window of the High Council chamber watching his world die slowly around him. The Keth Empire had arrived 3 days ago with ships that looked like giant insects made of metal and flesh moving through space like living nightmares, and their weapons turned the beautiful crystal cities of his people into smoking ruins, filled with screams and death. Vextai was old even by Valari standards, with pale blue skin that showed the wisdom marks of his many years and eyes that had seen peace for most of his long life. But now those same eyes watched as his people ran through the streets trying to escape the Keith soldiers who hunted them, like animals. The Valari were peaceful people who built beautiful things and studied the stars and grew gardens that could feed entire cities. But they had never learned to fight wars because they had never needed to fight wars until now, when it was too late to learn. Behind him, the other council members argued about surrender terms and evacuation plans, but Vextai knew the truth that none of them wanted to speak out loud because the Keth Empire did not take prisoners, and they did not make deals with those they called lesser beings. He had read the reports from other worlds that fell to the Keth forces, and the stories were always the same, with entire populations disappearing into the bioships, where they became part of the living machinery that powered the Empire's endless hunger for conquest and expansion. The quantum communicator on his desk buzzed with another desperate message from the outer settlements begging for help that would never come because the Valari had no military and no allies willing to stand against the Keith Empire's growing power. Vextai walked to the ancient device and stared at its glowing surface, thinking about the one option that no member of the Galactic Union had ever tried before because it violated every law and treaty that held their civilization together. In the deepest archives of the Council Library, there were files marked with warnings and seals that spoke of a quarantined system at the edge of known space, where a species called humans lived on a world so dangerous that most aliens would die within hours of setting foot on its surface. The Galactic Union had discovered Earth only 50 years ago during a routine survey mission, and the Discovery team had barely escaped alive after their ship's sensors registered atmospheric conditions that should have been impossible for any complex life to survive. The planet had crushing gravity that would break the bones of most species, and an atmosphere filled with poisonous gases and radiation levels that could kill a Valari in minutes. But somehow the humans not only survived, but thrived in conditions that the galaxy's scientists called a Class 9 death world. The reports described beings that looked similar to many humanoid species but moved with the fluid grace of apex predators and had forward-facing eyes that marked them as hunters, from a world where everything wanted to kill everything else. Their technology was crude by galactic standards but built with a redundancy and durability that seemed almost paranoid, until you understood that it had to survive in an environment that actively tried to destroy anything that existed on its surface. The Galactic Union had placed Earth under strict quarantine, not because the humans were hostile, but because they were terrifying in ways that most civilized species could not understand or accept. Vextai had read testimonies from the survey team describing how the humans they briefly contacted moved through their deadly environment like it was perfectly normal, and built cities in places where the very air would corrode most starship hulls. But what truly frightened the galactic community was not the humans themselves, but what they represented. Because if a species could evolve and thrive on such a nightmare world, then what would they be capable of if they ever left that world? The official policy was complete isolation, with monitoring stations placed at the edge of the Sol system to watch for any signs that the humans were developing faster than light travel, which thankfully seemed beyond their current capabilities. Now, as Vextai watched another Keth bioship descend toward the capital city, like a living mountain of death, he found himself wondering if the galaxy's fears about the humans might actually be exactly what his people needed. The quantum communicator crackled with static as another settlement went dark forever, and Vextai made a decision that would either save his people or damn them to something worse than the Keith Empire. He began typing coordinates that no member of the Galactic Union had ever transmitted before, while behind him the other council members continued their useless debates about honor and proper procedure. The message he composed was simple because complex communications might not translate properly across the vast differences between Valari and human languages and technology. This is SciFiPrime. We are under attack. If any being receives this message, please help us. We are dying. Vextai stared at the words for a long moment, knowing that sending them would make him a criminal in the eyes of every civilized species in the galaxy, but also knowing that his people would be extinct long before any galactic court could put him on trial. The transmission would take 3 days to reach the Sol system, and even then there was no guarantee that the humans would receive it or understand it, or care enough to do anything about the suffering of an alien species they had never met. But as another explosion shook the council building and the screams from the streets grew louder, Vextai pressed the transmit button and sent his desperate plea racing across the void toward the quarantined world at the edge of space. The signal burst from the quantum array with enough power to reach halfway across the galaxy, carrying with it the hopes and fears of an entire civilization that had run out of options and time. 3 days, later on, a world of crushing gravity and poisonous air, where apex predators had learned to build starships and dream of the stars. A young communications officer named Gunwoo sat at his console in the Korean Space Defense Command, monitoring the usual background chatter of deep space. The signal that appeared on his screen was unlike anything in the databases, with encryption patterns that suggested non-human origin and a transmission vector that came from somewhere far beyond the normal. Shipping lanes. Gunwoo called his supervisor, and within minutes the message was being analyzed by teams of linguists and xenobiologists who worked frantically to decode what appeared to be a first contact scenario. By the time they understood what they were looking at, Admiral Minho was standing in the command center, staring at a translation that made his blood run cold, because somewhere in the darkness between the stars, an entire civilization was crying out for help. The debate that followed would be remembered as the moment when humanity stepped onto the galactic stage, not as explorers or diplomats, but as something far more dangerous and far more necessary. President Sunwoo made the final decision in a closed session with his military advisors, knowing that what they were about to do would change everything for both Earth and the galaxy beyond. Within hours of receiving the Volari distress call, the largest fleet Earth had ever assembled began moving toward the launch bays, while across the planet other nations contributed ships and crews to a mission that violated every treaty humanity had never signed. They were going to answer the call for help, because that was what humans did, even when it was dangerous, and even when it was stupid, and even when the entire galaxy would probably hate them for it afterward. Admiral Minho stood on the bridge of the Taiguchi, watching through the reinforced viewport as the largest fleet Earth had ever assembled prepared for departure from the orbital shipyards above Korea. The flagship was a testament to human engineering, philosophy built not for elegance like the ships described in galactic databases, but for survival in an environment that wanted to kill everything that moved through it. Every system had 3 backups, and every backup had its own backup, because when you came from a world where solar flares could fry electronics and asteroid impacts happened every few thousand years, you learned to build things that could keep working. Even when half destroyed, Commander Gina approached with the final crew. Reports showing that volunteers from 12 different nations had joined the mission, including specialists who had never worked together before, but shared the same determination to answer a cry for help from across the galaxy. The human ships looked strange compared to the sleek vessels shown in captured galactic surveillance footage, because they were built like fortresses that could move through space rather than graceful works of art that happened to have engines. Captain Daehyun commanded the heavy cruiser Busan, which carried enough armor plating to stop a direct hit from most known weapons, and enough firepower to crack an asteroid into pieces small enough for mining operations. The ship designs reflected humanity's approach to everything they built on Earth, where nothing lasted long unless it could survive earthquakes and hurricanes and solar radiation that would sterilize most garden worlds. Captain Boyoung led the scout squadron in ships that could accelerate fast, enough to escape Earth's gravity well in emergency situations, and turn sharp enough to avoid the space debris that constantly rained down on their home system. Every vessel in the fleet carried marine detachments led by Major Taiwan, whose soldiers, trained in powered armor designed for Earth's crushing gravity, and wore environmental suits that could keep them alive in conditions that would kill most aliens instantly. Dr. Hyejin worked frantically in the medical bay studying what little data they had about Volari physiology, while preparing for the possibility that they might encounter wounded aliens whose biology was completely different from anything on Earth. The hyperspace jump coordinates were locked in, despite the fact that no human ship had ever traveled so far from the Sol system, and the navigation computers had to extrapolate routes through regions of space that appeared blank on every star. Chart Admiral Minho gave the departure order, and one by one the human ships activated their jump drives using technology that the galaxy considered primitive, but which had the advantage of being too simple to break down under stress. The fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of an unknown system where long-range sensors immediately detected signs of conflict, including debris fields that showed the remains of what appeared to be civilian vessels. Captain Boyoung took point in the scout ship Seoul, moving carefully through the wreckage while scanning for survivors, or any indication of what had happened to the people who sent the distress call. The first contact came sooner than anyone expected when passive sensors detected a damaged ship drifting without power near the outer planets of the system with life, signs aboard that matched the biosignatures from the original transmission. Commander Gina led the rescue operation, personally taking a boarding team across to the alien vessel, while Dr. Hyejin prepared the medical bay for patients whose physiology she could only guess at. The airlock cycled open, and for the first time in human history, members of two different species looked at each other across the gap between worlds that had never known each other existed. The Valari survivors were smaller than humans, with pale blue skin and large eyes that seemed to take up too much of their faces, but their expressions of fear and hope needed no translation. Sylvan was the youngest of the refugees, barely more than a child by Valari standards, but she spoke the trade language well enough to serve as translator between her people and the strange beings who had come from nowhere to help them. She tried to explain what had happened to her world using words and concepts that had no equivalent in human experience, because the Keth Empire was unlike anything Earth had ever faced. The Keth were not just conquerors, but something worse, because they did not simply kill or enslave their victims, but incorporated them into their living ships, where consciousness remained but free will disappeared forever. The bioships were not built, but grown from the merged flesh and minds of conquered species, creating vessels that combined organic adaptability with technological efficiency in ways that violated every human understanding of right and wrong. Sylvan described how the Keth fleet had arrived without warning, using ships that looked like enormous insects made of metal and living tissue that moved through space with predatory intelligence. The Valari had tried to surrender, hoping to preserve their civilization through negotiation, but the Keth had not come to negotiate because they viewed other species as raw materials rather than intelligent beings worthy of consideration. As the human fleet moved deeper into the system, Admiral Minho received his first communications from other galactic powers, including angry demands that he withdraw immediately from what they called a restricted conflict zone. The Galactic Union sent Ambassador Zethkol to deliver an ultimatum, threatening economic sanctions and military action if the human fleet did not return to their quarantine system immediately. Admiral Minho's response was broadcast on all frequencies in clear language that left no room for misinterpretation about human intentions regarding the situation they had discovered. The Korean admiral explained that his people had received a distress call and were responding according to their own laws and customs, which did not recognize galactic authority over humanitarian missions. He pointed out that the Galactic Union had made no effort to help the Valari, despite being fully aware of the Keth Empire's expansion and the threat it posed to peaceful civilizations throughout the region. The human position was simple and non-negotiable because they had not come to conquer or claim territory, but to help people who had asked for help, and they would not be deterred by threats from powers that had ignored those same peoples. Suffering Captain Daehyun reported that his sensors were detecting massive energy signatures from the inner system, where the Keth fleet appeared to be concentrated around the third planet, which matched the coordinates from the original distress call. The alien refugees confirmed that SciFiPrime was their homeworld, and that millions of their people were still trapped on the surface under Keth occupation, while others had been taken aboard the bioships for purposes too horrible to describe. Lieutenant Gunwoo detected something that changed the entire tactical situation when his deep-range scanners revealed that the Keth ships were using some kind of organic shielding that appeared to incorporate living beings into their defensive systems. Dr. Hyejin analyzed the sensor data and reached a conclusion that horrified even the battle-hardened Marines, because the Keth were literally using captured Valari as living components in their ship defenses. Major Taiwan requested permission to begin planning boarding operations using tactics developed for fighting in the cramped confines of asteroid mining stations and orbital habitats, where conventional weapons were too dangerous to use. The human fleet continued its approach toward Thyros Prime while galactic observers watched in fascination and terror as the quarantined Deathworlders prepared to engage an enemy that had conquered dozens of star systems without serious opposition. Admiral Minho knew that what happened in the next few hours would determine not only the fate of the Valari people, but also humanity's place in a galaxy that had spent 50 years trying to pretend Earth did not exist. The ships of the human fleet moved through space like predators approaching prey, because that was exactly what they were. And the Keth Empire was about to discover why evolution on a Class 9 death world produced species that other civilizations preferred to keep in quarantine. Behind them, the refugee ship followed under escort, carrying the survivors who would witness either the salvation or the destruction of their people at the hands of beings from a world so dangerous that most of the galaxy considered it uninhabitable. The final approach to Thyros Prime began as human ships prepared for their first battle against an alien enemy, using weapons and tactics designed for the violent chaos of their home system, where only the strongest and most adaptable survived long enough to reach the stars. The human armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Thyros system, like a pack of metal predators entering unfamiliar hunting grounds, and immediately, every monitoring station within 50 light-years began broadcasting emergency alerts. Admiral Minho stood on the bridge of the Teguki, studying the tactical display that showed dozens of Keth bioships arranged in a defensive formation around the third planet, while smaller vessels patrolled the outer system like living sentinels. The alien fleet looked organic in ways that made human observers uncomfortable, because the ships appeared to breathe and pulse with internal rhythms that suggested they were not built, but grown from some nightmare combination of technology and biology. Commander Gina reported that communications channels were flooding with transmissions from various galactic governments, demanding explanations for the unprecedented violation of quarantine protocols and first contact procedures. The Galactic Union's response came through Ambassador Zethkol, whose message carried the weight of accumulated authority from dozens of member species who had never seen humans as anything more than dangerous curiosities to be contained. The ambassador's ultimatum was clear and non-negotiable, because the human fleet had exactly 1 hour to withdraw from the system before facing the combined military might of the civilized galaxy. Admiral Minho's response was broadcast on all frequencies in the calm professional tone that Korean naval officers had used for centuries when delivering unpleasant news to people who thought they were in charge. The admiral explained that his fleet had received a legitimate distress call from beings who were facing extinction, and that humanitarian law, as understood by human civilization, took precedence over any territorial claims or bureaucratic procedures. He pointed out that the Galactic Union had known about the Keth Empire's expansion for decades, but had done nothing to protect the species being conquered and enslaved by what any reasonable observer would call crimes against sentience itself. The Korean officer made it clear that his people would not abandon innocent beings to torture and death simply because helping them violated rules created by governments that had never bothered to introduce themselves to Earth in the first place. Captain Boyoung transmitted detailed sensor readings of the Keth fleet to the watching galactic observers, showing the bioships in all their horrible glory with organic components that pulsed with what appeared to be the life force of incorporated beings. The tactical analysis that followed horrified even veteran military commanders from species that had seen war, because the Keth ships were not just using advanced biotechnology, but were literally powered by the suffering of their victims. Lieutenant Gunwoo detected energy patterns that confirmed Dr. Heejin's worst fears about the nature of Keth biotechnology, because the ships were using captured Valari as living batteries, whose consciousness remained intact while their bodies provided power. The revelation that sentient beings were being used as components in starship construction violated every law of war recognized by civilized species and created a legal justification for immediate intervention under humanitarian protocols. War leader Crexmore commanded the Keth fleet from his flagship, which looked like a massive insect made of black metal and pulsing flesh that moved through space with predatory intelligence, seeking new prey to consume. The Kith commander initially dismissed the human ships as primitive vessels built by a species too crude to understand the elegant fusion of biology and technology that made his empire invincible. Keth intelligence had no data on humans beyond basic physical descriptions because the Galactic Union had classified all information about Earth under the highest security protocols to prevent contact with the quarantined Deathworlders. The alien commander expected the human fleet to withdraw once they understood the futility of challenging an empire that had conquered dozens of star systems using biotechnology beyond the comprehension of lesser. Species Captain Daehyun reported that his heavy cruiser was detecting massive energy buildups from the Keth bioships as they prepared what appeared to be some kind of organic weapon system that had never been encountered in any previous galactic conflict. The first engagement began when a patrol of Keth scouts moved to intercept the human rescue vessels heading toward HFY, using ships that looked like flying predators, hunting in coordinated packs. Commander Gina led the escort force. In the Soul, which had been built to survive direct hits from asteroid fragments traveling at interplanetary velocities, and armed with weapons designed to break up space debris that threatened Earth's orbital installations, the Keth scouts attacked with bioplasma weapons that could dissolve the hulls of most galactic starships. But the human vessels absorbed the hits with armor plating that had been tested against solar flares and micrometeorite impacts. The return fire from human ships surprised the Keth attackers because the weapons were not energy beams or particle streams, but solid projectiles fired at relativistic velocities using magnetic acceleration systems designed for mining operations. The kinetic projectiles punched through Keth bioarmor, like bullets through tissue because the alien ships had evolved to defend against energy weapons rather than simple chunks of metal moving at significant fractions of light speed. War leader Crexmore watched his scouts being destroyed by what appeared to be primitive kinetic weapons and began to understand that he was facing something outside his experience and training. The human ships moved through space with aggressive efficiency that reminded galactic observers of apex predators from their own homeworlds, but scaled up to starship proportions with all the terrible implications that entailed. Admiral Minho authorized what he called Protocol 7, which was a designation that existed in human military doctrine, for situations where the normal rules of engagement were insufficient to address crimes against sentience. The authorization meant that his fleet was now operating under total war conditions, with no restrictions on weapons usage or tactical approaches, beyond the requirement to minimize collateral damage to innocent civilians. Major Taehwan received orders to prepare his marine boarding teams for assault operations against hostile vessels, using tactics developed for fighting in the confined spaces of asteroid mining facilities and deep ocean installations. The powered armor worn by human marines had been designed for Earth's crushing gravity and toxic atmosphere, which meant it could operate in environments that would kill most alien species. Within minutes, Dr. Hyejin worked frantically to develop countermeasures against Keth biotechnology, using her knowledge of Earth's evolutionary biology and the assumption that all life followed similar basic principles, regardless of planetary origin. Galactic observers watching the developing battle began to understand why Earth had been classified as a quarantined death world, because the humans were fighting with the casual efficiency of beings who had evolved in an environment where violence was a daily necessity. Captain Boyoung's scout squadron moved through the Keth formation like sharks through a school of fish, using superior acceleration and maneuverability to avoid return fire, while targeting the bioship's apparent weak points. Human ships demonstrated why they had been built with such excessive redundancy, as they continued fighting even after sustaining damage that would have disabled vessels from more peaceful civilizations. Lieutenant Gunwoo made a discovery that changed the tactical situation when his sensors detected the exact locations of Valari life signs within the Keth bioships and transmitted the coordinates to the fleet's targeting computers. The precision required to disable alien biotechnology without harming the incorporated victims demanded accuracy that only came from species that had learned to thread needles while riding earthquakes. Admiral Minho realized that his fleet was not just fighting a battle, but making a statement to the entire galaxy about what happened when someone asked humans for help, and what happened to those who got in the way. The engagement escalated as more Keth vessels moved to engage the human fleet, while galactic powers debated whether to intervene on behalf of their established order or allow the Deathworlders to solve a problem they had been too civilized to address. War leader Crexmore prepared to demonstrate why the Keth Empire had never been defeated by calling upon biotechnology that incorporated the life force of entire species into weapons capable of sterilizing planets. The battle for Thyros Prime was about to begin in earnest, and the galaxy would discover what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object in the form of humans who had promised to help and had no intention of breaking that promise. The battle for Thyros Prime erupted across the star system as the human fleet engaged the Keth Armada in combat that defied every assumption the galaxy had made about warfare between civilized species. Admiral Minho watched from the bridge of the Taguki as his ships demonstrated why evolution on a Class 9 death world produced beings that other species preferred to keep in quarantine rather than face an open conflict. The Keth bioships unleashed weapons that had conquered dozens of star systems, including plasma streams that could melt through conventional armor and bioacid clouds that dissolved anything they touched into component molecules. Human vessels absorbed these attacks with armor plating designed to survive re-entry through Earth's atmosphere and impact with objects traveling at orbital velocities. Because when you came from a world where everything tried to kill you every day, you learned to build things accordingly. Captain Daehyun commanded the heavy cruiser Busan as it charged directly through a formation of Keth destroyers using its reinforced hull as a battering ram, while point defense systems cleared a path through the swarm of biofighters that tried to stop it. The human ship's weapons were not elegant, energy beams or exotic particle streams, but simple kinetic projectiles fired by magnetic accelerators that had been designed to break up asteroids threatening Earth's orbital installations. The solid slugs punched through Keth bioarmor with devastating effect, because the alien ships had evolved defenses against energy weapons rather than chunks of metal moving at significant fractions of light. Speed War leader Crexmore realized he was facing something unprecedented in the Empire's expansion when his scouts reported that human ships continued fighting even after sustaining damage that should have disabled them completely. The Deathworlders had built their vessels with redundancy that bordered on paranoia, because on Earth, a single system, failure could mean death from radiation exposure or atmospheric decompression, or gravitational stress. Commander Gina led a squadron of destroyers through the Keth formation, using tactics that resembled pack hunting more than conventional naval warfare as the human ships coordinated their attacks with predatory efficiency. The aliens found themselves outmaneuvered by vessels that appeared crude, but possessed acceleration capabilities necessary for escape from Earth's massive gravity well and turning radii developed for navigating asteroid fields. Major Taehwan prepared his marine boarding teams for assault operations against the Keth bioships, using powered armor that could operate in the vacuum of space or the crushing depths of Earth's oceans with equal effectiveness. The human marines moved through their ships like apex predators preparing for a hunt, because that was exactly what they were, and the Keth Empire was about to discover what happened when evolution's finest killers decided you needed to die. Dr. Hijin made a breakthrough in understanding Keth biotechnology when she realized that the living ships were actually enslaved creatures whose nervous systems had been hijacked and modified to serve as organic computers and power sources. Her analysis revealed that the bioships retained enough of their original consciousness to potentially break free from Keth control, if the neural interface networks could be severed at specific points that corresponded to analogous structures in Earth biology. The medical officer transmitted her findings to the fleet's tactical computers, which updated targeting priorities to focus on the organic control nodes that kept the captured beings enslaved within their own bodies. Captain Boyoung led the first boarding operation against a Keth destroyer that had been disabled by precisely placed kinetic rounds that severed its neural networks without killing the organic components. The human assault team moved through the alien vessel like a force of nature, because their powered armor allowed them to operate in environmental conditions that would kill most species within seconds. The Keth defenders found themselves facing beings who moved with the fluid grace of apex predators and possessed strength that seemed impossible for creatures of their size, until you understood they had evolved under gravity that would crush most aliens. Major Taehwan's Marines used weapons designed for close quarters combat in asteroid mining facilities, including magnetic grapple guns and plasma cutters that could slice through bulkheads or enemy armor with equal effectiveness. The boarding action revealed the true horror of Keth biotechnology, as the humans discovered chambers filled with Valari prisoners who had been partially integrated into the ship's living systems, but retained enough consciousness to understand their fate. The Marine commander made a decision that would echo throughout galactic history when he ordered his teams to begin liberation operations, despite the tactical disadvantage of fighting, while protecting helpless civilians. Lieutenant Gunwu detected massive energy buildups from the Keth flagship as war leader Crexmore prepared to unleash bioweapons that incorporated the life force of entire conquered species into planet-killing energies. The human fleet responded by implementing tactics that had been developed for fighting in the chaotic environment of the Sol system, where solar flares and asteroid impacts created constantly changing battlefield conditions. Admiral Minho authorized the use of improvised weapons when conventional systems proved insufficient, including manufacturing facilities that could produce kinetic projectiles from raw materials scavenged from disabled enemy vessels. The Taiguchi demonstrated human adaptability when its main weapons failed, and the crew used the ship's industrial fabrication systems to create magnetic railguns from mining equipment and structural components. Captain Daehyun's heavy cruiser sustained massive damage but continued fighting, using backup systems and jury-rigged repairs that kept critical functions operational, despite hull breaches and power fluctuations that would have crippled most vessels. The Busan vented atmosphere to confuse enemy sensors, while the crew worked in vacuum suits to reroute power systems and restore weapons that had been damaged but not destroyed by Keth. Bioplasma attacks. Dr. Heejin's research team developed a method for severing the neural control networks that enslaved the bioships by targeting specific organic interfaces with precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses that disrupted alien neurology without harming human technology. The liberation technology was transmitted to all human vessels, which began systematically freeing the enslaved creatures that formed the core of Keth military power, while the aliens watched their fleet turn against itself. War leader Crexmore found his carefully planned battle becoming a nightmare as his bioships began responding to their original programming rather than his commands, because the humans had discovered how to break the chains that bound them. The Keth commander realized he was facing beings who had learned to survive in an environment so hostile that they treated interstellar warfare as a relatively minor challenge compared to daily life on their homeworld. Captain Boyong's liberation teams worked frantically to free captured Valari from the organic integration chambers, while fighting running battles against Keth security forces who tried to stop the rescue operations. The human Marines demonstrated why their species had survived on a Class 9 death world, as they adapted to alien technology and hostile environments with the same casual efficiency they used for routine maintenance on their own ships. Lieutenant Gunwu made another crucial discovery when his sensors revealed that war leader Crexmore was preparing to crash his damaged flagship into HFY rather than accept defeat at the hands of what he considered primitive Deathworlders. The revelation that millions of innocent civilians were about to die because an alien warlord preferred genocide to surrender triggered a response from the human fleet that would demonstrate why Earth had been quarantined in the first place. Admiral Minho prepared to make a sacrifice that would save an alien world at the cost of his own ship, because that was what humans did when faced with a choice between their own survival and the protection of innocent life. The final battle for SciFiPrime began when war leader Crexmore made a decision that would define him as either a warrior willing to die for his beliefs or a monster who preferred genocide to defeat. Lieutenant Gunwu watched his sensors in horror as the massive Keith flagship began falling toward the planet's surface with enough mass and velocity to create an extinction-level impact that would kill millions of innocent Valari civilians. Admiral Minho stood on the bridge of the Taiguchi, knowing that conventional weapons could not stop a ship that large from completing its deadly trajectory, but also knowing that one ship might be able to intercept it. The Korean admiral gave the order that would be remembered throughout galactic history as the moment when humanity announced its presence to the universe not as conquerors or diplomats, but as protectors willing to sacrifice themselves for strangers. Captain Boyoung received the intercept coordinates and began calculating the precise trajectory needed to catch the falling Keth bioship without allowing it to reach the planet's surface, where it would create a crater visible from orbit. The Taguchi accelerated toward the doomed flagship using engines designed to escape Earth's massive gravity well and structural reinforcement that could survive the crushing forces of atmospheric entry at interplanetary velocities. Commander Gina coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel, while Dr. Hyejin prepared emergency medical stations for casualties from both human and alien crews, because the coming collision would spare no one. The human flagship caught the Keith bioship at an altitude of 50 kilometers above HFY's surface and began the controlled descent that would save a planet at the cost of both vessels. Admiral Minho and Captain Boyoung worked together to guide the falling ships away from populated areas, while their crews fought fires and hull breaches and system failures that multiplied. With each passing second, the two vessels burned through the atmosphere like falling stars visible to every survivor on the planet's surface, as they disintegrated around crews who refused to abandon their posts even when death became inevitable. Major Taiwan led evacuation teams through corridors filled with toxic smoke and radiation from damaged systems, while making sure that every Valari prisoner rescued from the Keth ship reached the escape pods safely. The Marine commander demonstrated the human commitment to protecting innocent life when he personally carried wounded aliens to safety. Despite injuries that would have incapacitated most species, war leader Krexmore found himself rescued by the same beings he had tried to destroy, and realized that he was facing a species that operated according to principles his empire had forgotten, in its hunger for conquest and expansion. The crash site became a monument to sacrifice as rescue teams from both fleets worked together to save survivors while the wreckage of two starships cooled in the alien soil of a world that would remember this day forever. Dr. Hyejin established field hospitals that treated human and alien wounded with equal care, because medical ethics, as understood by her species, made no distinction between patients based on their planetary origin or political affiliations. Commander Gina assumed fleet command and began negotiations with the surviving Keth forces, who had watched their leader's final act with growing understanding that this war had ended in a way none of them had expected. The remaining bioships surrendered one by one as their liberated organic components refused to fight against beings who had freed them from slavery and shown them what mercy looked like in practice. Captain Daehyun's heavy cruiser limped through space with half its systems offline, but its crew still working to rescue survivors from disabled alien vessels, because that was what humans did regardless of which side those aliens had been fighting on. The galactic observers who had come to watch the destruction of the quarantined Deathworlders instead witnessed something that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of civilized behavior. Ambassador Zethkul transmitted a message to the Galactic Union that would reshape diplomatic relations throughout known space, because the humans had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond simple military prowess. The Deathworlders had shown tactical innovation that turned enemy weapons against themselves, strategic thinking that prioritized civilian protection over military advantage, and ethical standards that extended mercy even to those who had shown none. Sylvan stood among the rescued Valari refugees and spoke for her people when she formally requested alliance with the humans, because they had proven themselves worthy of trust in ways that no other species had ever demonstrated. The young alien's words were broadcast throughout the galaxy as she described how beings from a quarantined world had traveled across impossible distances to save strangers, simply because those strangers had asked for help. Lieutenant Gunwoo detected massive fleet movements as various galactic powers repositioned their forces in response to the demonstration of human capabilities and the implications for existing power structures. The Korean communications officer reported that dozens of species were requesting formal diplomatic contact with Earth despite decades of official policy that had treated humanity as too dangerous for civilized interaction. Dr. Hyejin found herself overwhelmed with requests for medical cooperation from alien physicians who wanted to understand how human medicine could treat species that had never been encountered before. The medical officer realized that her people possessed knowledge and techniques that could benefit the entire galaxy, because evolution on a Class 9 death world had forced them to develop solutions to problems that other species had never faced. Major Taiwan received commendations from alien military commanders who had witnessed his Marines fighting to protect civilians regardless of species or political affiliation. In situations where most soldiers would have prioritized their own survival, The Marine commander understood that his people had become something unprecedented in galactic history because they combined the combat effectiveness of apex predators with ethical standards that demanded protection of the innocent. Admiral Minho survived the crash of his flagship and found himself appointed as Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Union, despite having no diplomatic training beyond the simple principle that you help people who ask for help. The Korean officer's appointment reflected humanity's approach to interstellar relations because they valued practical experience and moral character over formal education and bureaucratic credentials. Captain Bo Young recovered from injuries sustained during the controlled crash and became the first human to command a mixed-species crew when Valari volunteers requested assignment to the rebuilt human fleet. The pilot's new responsibilities included training alien crews in human tactical doctrine and learning alien technologies that could enhance Earth's defensive capabilities without compromising their core principles. War leader Crexmore faced trial by a tribunal that included humans among its judges and discovered that the Deathworlders advocated for rehabilitation rather than execution because they believed that any being could change given proper motivation. The former Keth commander's sentence included working with liberated bioship consciousnesses to develop new forms of cooperative biotechnology that enhanced rather than enslaved organic intelligence. The aftermath of the Battle of SciFiPrime saw thousands of alien refugees relocating to the Sol system, where they found a world that challenged their assumptions about habitability but offered opportunities that existed nowhere else. President Sunwoo announced that Earth's status had changed from quarantined death world to galactic protectorate with responsibilities for protecting species that could not protect themselves from threats like the Keith Empire. The Korean leader's declaration established humanity as the galaxy's unofficial police force, not through conquest or intimidation, but through demonstrated willingness to fight. For principles that transcended species boundaries, Ambassador Zethkol sent a final message to the Galactic Union, acknowledging that they had misjudged the quarantined humans, who proved to be exactly what the galaxy needed, even if they were not what anyone had expected. The alien diplomat's report concluded with a recommendation that Earth be invited to join the galactic community as full members with voting rights and defensive responsibilities that matched their unique capabilities. Story ended with human ships patrolling space lanes that had been controlled by predators and pirates, while alien civilizations learned to call on the Deathworlders when problems arose that required solutions beyond conventional diplomacy. Galaxy discovered that sometimes the most dangerous beings made the best protectors because they understood violence well enough to use it precisely and possessed moral codes that demanded its use only in defense of those who could not defend themselves.